She thought she was boarding a plane to meet her soulmate, but she never made it home. A successful widow from the Philippines risked everything for love, flying 8,000 miles to the man of her dreams. Instead, she stepped into a motel room that would become her worst nightmare. What really happened inside room 108? Who was the stranger waiting for her, and why had he done this before? This story is more than a romance gone wrong. It's a chilling game of lies, money, and trust twisted into something deadly. Stay until the end, because the final truth behind room 108 will haunt you. The departure lounge at Francisco Bangoy International Airport in Davao City hummed with the usual rhythm of travel. Families clutching duty-free bags, businessmen hunched over laptops, children weaving through rows of seats. Among the swirl of passengers stood Elena Navarro, 54 years old, widow, mother of 3, and owner of a modest textile company. Her hair was carefully pulled back, her best dress pressed, her eyes bright yet tired. In her hands, she gripped something that felt far heavier than its weight, a one-way ticket to Dallas, Texas. For most travelers, an overseas flight was simply a trip for business, tourism, or migration. For Elena, it was a leap into the unknown, a gamble she framed as faith. She had never set foot in the United States, never even traveled beyond Southeast Asia. Yet now she was convinced her new life waited for her on the other side of the Pacific. The man she believed God had placed in her path, a man who called himself Ryan Cole Matthews, had promised to be waiting with open arms. Her children, however, were not smiling. At breakfast that morning, the mood had been somber. Arturo, her eldest, had tried to hide his anger beneath forced calm. He reminded her, again and again, that this man she spoke of so tenderly was still a stranger. Lena, compassionate and protective, had begged her mother to reconsider, voice trembling with fear of losing her. Paolo, the youngest, had been quiet, but his eyes brimmed with the kind of worry words could not carry. Yet Elena, with the same stubbornness that had carried her through years of raising children alone, told them this was something she had to do. For years, she had built businesses, guided employees, carried burdens without faltering. For years, she had been the strong one. Now she wanted to believe someone else could carry her heart. As she queued at security, Elena scrolled through her phone, pausing on a message from Ryan. "Soon we'll start the life we talked about. Just us." She smiled faintly, ignoring the nagging echo of her children's warnings. She tapped out a reply. "Almost boarding. Pray for us." Then she snapped a selfie, her best smile, nerves hidden beneath hope, and sent it to her family group chat with the caption, "Your mama is going on an adventure." The photo showed a woman radiant with expectation, but behind the smile there was a quiver of doubt she refused to name. She had read stories before, rumors in the parish bulletin about overseas scams, tales her business partner once whispered about relatives deceived by sweet-talking men online. Elena told herself this was different. Ryan was different. Still, the silence that hung at the breakfast table lingered in her chest as she walked toward Gate 5. Her children's faces, worried, pleading, flashed across her mind. Arturo's firm voice, Lena's tearful protest, Paolo's soft whisper, "Don't go alone, Ma." She carried those words with her, heavier than the suitcase she wheeled behind. The boarding announcement echoed, "Flight PR 102 to Dubai, continuing to Dallas, now boarding all passengers." Elena's heart quickened. This was it, the point of no return. She stepped forward, handed over her ticket, and moved down the jet bridge, the metallic echo of her footsteps merging with the low hum of anticipation. For Elena, the journey was more than miles. It was a passage from years of solitude into the possibility of companionship. She imagined Ryan's bouquet waiting at arrivals, his hand reaching for hers, their voices blending in prayer before a shared meal. In her mind, this was the reward for endurance, the blessing after years of emptiness. Yet as the aircraft engines roared and the city lights of Davao shrank into dots, one question lingered, louder than the cabin noise. What if her children were right? The thought pricked at her resolve, but she pushed it aside. Faith, she reminded herself, required trust, and she had chosen to trust in the story Ryan painted for her, no matter how much the world doubted it. 18 hours of travel stretched ahead. Dubai lay first, then the Atlantic, then Dallas. Elena leaned back in her seat, whispered a prayer under her breath, and let herself believe, for now, that this ticket was the start of a love story, not the prologue to something darker. Before Elena Navarro became the woman standing at that departure gate, she had already lived several lives. In Davao City, people knew her as the woman who could make miracles out of fabric. Her textile shop, tucked into a busy street corner, buzzed with the clatter of sewing machines and the low hum of laughter from her 12 employees. Elena wasn't just their employer, she was their champion. If one of them fell ill, she covered medical bills. If another needed a salary advance to pay school fees, she never said no. The shop itself was modest, bare fluorescent lights, bolts of fabric stacked floor to ceiling, and a faint smell of starch and thread in the air, but it carried Elena's imprint of order and dignity. Customers often left with more than tailored uniforms or dresses. They carried away stories of a widow who, despite loss, never stopped giving. That loss, however, was never far behind her. 6 years earlier, her husband, Mateo, had taken his motorcycle out for a quick errand and never returned. A roadside accident ended his life abruptly, leaving Elena with 3 children and a grief too heavy for words. For months, she woke up reaching across an empty bed, still half expecting his voice in the kitchen, his keys jingling by the door. But life did not pause. Arturo, then in his early 20s, stepped in as the quiet protector of the family, shouldering responsibilities his father once carried. Lena, compassionate to the core, pursued nursing, often bringing home tales of patients who reminded her of her father's kindness. Paolo, barely out of high school, dreamed of becoming an engineer and spent long nights sketching designs at the kitchen table. Together they admired their mother, who had turned mourning into momentum. Elena poured herself into work and into them. She skipped luxuries so tuition was always paid. She stayed up late repairing school uniforms by hand when deadlines at the shop ran tight. She kept Mateo's memory alive, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet resilience she modeled daily. The community admired her too. Parish leaders called on her when they needed help, raising funds for relief drives. Struggling neighbors knew she would quietly slip an envelope under their doors or hire them at her shop, no questions asked. "Ma'am Navarro has a big heart," people would say, and Elena would smile shyly, never comfortable with praise. Yet, for all her success and generosity, there was an emptiness she rarely voiced. The house that once echoed with laughter grew quieter as her children left for Quezon City to study and later to work. Holidays brought them back, but the days in between stretched long. Dinners were taken alone at a small table too big for one. Evenings ended with prayers and silence. When she turned 54, the milestone came and went with little fanfare. Her employees gifted her flowers, her children called from afar, but the day itself ended like every other. Elena, alone in her home, staring at framed photographs of family trips long past. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that solitude was a kind of strength. Still, a small voice whispered, "What about love? What about companionship?" Elena's identity had become that of a provider, a mother, a community anchor. But deep down, she was still a woman who missed being held, missed laughter across the dinner table, missed being someone's chosen person. As the anniversary of Mateo's death circled again, grief returned in waves. She busied herself at the shop, but the weight of absence pressed harder. Financially, the pandemic had carved deep scars into her business, and though she fought to recover, the strain showed. Nights were filled not only with loneliness, but with worry. About bills, about the future, about whether she could keep everything afloat alone. One evening, over coffee with her sister, Elena finally confessed what she had buried for years. Her voice broke as she said, "I feel forgotten. Not as a mother, not as a boss, but as a woman." Her sister squeezed her hand across the table, offering comfort. But the words lingered long after. That night, in her quiet home, Elena stared at her phone. The thought of searching for love online had always seemed foreign, something for younger people or those less rooted in tradition. But as she sat alone, the silence pressing in, she realized that if she didn't take a step, she might spend the rest of her life waiting for something that would never come. She wasn't looking for wealth or excitement, just companionship, someone who shared her faith, her values, her rhythm of life. And so, with trembling fingers and a cautious heart, she downloaded an app called Cross Paths. In her profile, she wrote simply, "Widow, business owner, faithful, looking for a companion to share life with." She uploaded 2 photos, one of her in the shop surrounded by spools of thread, another in her small garden, sunlight soft on her face. Then she hit submit, whispering a prayer that maybe, just maybe, someone out there would see her. Elena closed her phone that night with no expectations, yet beneath her cautious exterior, hope flickered like a candle reignited. She had built a life from scratch, raised children into adults, steered a business through storms. Now she allowed herself one daring thought. Perhaps she hadn't reached the end of her love story after all. The rhythm of Elena Navarro's days rarely changed. At 5 in the morning, before dawn crept over Davao City, she would rise from bed, slip into her slippers, and kneel beside the small table where her rosary rested. The prayers were quiet, deliberate, words whispered into the stillness of a house that felt too large without her children. Afterward, she moved seamlessly into her responsibilities. By 7 o'clock, the textile shop was alive with motion, fabric stretched across cutting tables, sewing machines clattering like a steady drumbeat, employees greeting her with, "Good morning, Ma'am Elena." She smiled and guided their work, correcting a hem here, praising a design there. Outwardly, she seemed whole, the picture of a capable businesswoman. But when dusk arrived, the mask slipped. The shutters came down, employees dispersed, and Elena walked home, to silence. The house, once filled with laughter and Mateo's guitar strumming, was now a cavern echoing only her footsteps. Dinner was usually a bowl of rice and vegetables eaten at a table meant for 5. She sometimes left the television on for background noise, but even then, the loneliness pressed closer. Her children were absorbed in their lives in Quezon City. Arturo, the eldest, worked long hours managing logistics for a shipping company. Lena's nursing shifts consumed her energy. Paolo, the youngest, buried himself in engineering classes. They visited when they could, but the demands of their careers kept them away. Elena never blamed them. She had raised them to be independent. Yet independence left her alone. Her friends, noticing her solitude, often tried to intervene. "We know someone," they would say, suggesting introductions to widowers or single men in town. But every attempt felt wrong. The men they brought to her were either echoes of her late husband or strangers with whom she shared no spark. Elena began to wonder if her time for love had simply passed. One January evening, seated across from her sister at a small cafe, Elena finally voiced the thought she had long kept hidden. Stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, she whispered, "I feel invisible, not as a mother, not as a businesswoman, as a woman." The admission caught in her throat. Her sister reached across the table, clasped her hand, and offered comfort, but the words lingered after they left the cafe, heavier than the night air. Back home, Elena sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand. The glow of the screen illuminated her tired eyes. She had heard of dating platforms before, mostly from her nieces who teased her about modern love. For years, she dismissed the idea as frivolous or unsafe, but the silence in the room was suffocating. She longed for companionship, someone who could share faith, laughter, and the ordinary rhythms of life. Her finger hovered over the App Store until she finally pressed download, Cross Paths, an international Christian dating platform. The name alone felt like a small sign, as if lives could indeed intersect across oceans. The registration process was simple. She wrote a profile that reflected her truth: widow, business owner, devout, seeking companionship rooted in faith. She added photos that spoke to her life. One in her textile shop, smiling with spools of thread in the background. Another in her garden, kneeling among the flowers she tended each weekend. When she hit submit, Elena's heart pounded. She wasn't expecting miracles. She wasn't even sure she'd get responses. This was unfamiliar ground, something women her age didn't usually venture into. But beneath her skepticism was a fragile flame of hope. For a few days, nothing happened. Messages from strangers trickled in. Some generic greetings, others too forward for her comfort. She considered deleting the app, convincing herself it had been a mistake. Then, one evening, as the rain tapped against her window, her phone buzzed. And a new message appeared from someone named Ryan Cole Matthews. His introduction was polite, respectful, different from the others. He claimed to be 24 years old, working on oil rigs in Texas. His profile picture showed a young man in rugged work gear, another in a crisp shirt outside a church. The combination of strength and faith caught Elena's attention. His first words weren't clumsy flirtations, but a simple note. I admire strong women of faith. May I know your story? Elena hesitated, staring at the screen. She thought of her children's skepticism, of the warnings she'd read in newspapers, but something about the tone, earnest, unhurried, disarmed her. She typed a cautious reply. I am a widow from Davao. I run a small business. I live with faith. From there, a conversation began. Short exchanges at first, then longer ones. They talked about prayer, about family, about resilience in hard times. Ryan said he admired her strength, how she had raised 3 children alone. Elena felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. That night, for the first time in a long while, she didn't fall asleep to silence. She fell asleep with her phone still warm in her hand, carrying words from a stranger half a world away. She couldn't have known then that this window she opened to ease her loneliness would soon become a doorway into something far more dangerous. Elena Navarro never imagined that a stranger's words on a glowing screen could soften the silence of her evening so quickly. Yet by the end of January, her phone had become her constant companion. Messages from Ryan Cole. Matthews arrived like clockwork, peppered with Bible verses and phrases that seemed designed to reach the core of her faith. At first, she kept her guard up. She answered cautiously, offering polite responses, reminding herself that she had only just stepped into this unfamiliar world. But Ryan was patient. He never rushed, never crossed the line too early. Instead, he began by asking about her shop, her children, her garden. He even remembered small details like how she preferred roses over lilies or how her favorite color was deep blue. His story unfolded like a carefully scripted testimony. He said he was an oil rig worker in Texas, orphaned young, forced to grow up quickly. According to him, faith had been his anchor in stormy seas, and he dreamed of finding a woman who shared his devotion. Elena, used to men who bragged about achievements, found his vulnerability refreshing. By the second week, Ryan's words took on a different tone. They became more tender, sprinkled with admiration. "You're the kind of woman I prayed for," he wrote one evening, adding, "Your strength inspires me." Elena blushed, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. To her, these weren't just empty flattery. They felt like recognition. Still, doubts lingered. She wondered how someone so young, barely 24, could truly understand her. When she raised the issue, Ryan brushed it aside with effortless charm. "Age is numbers," he insisted. "What matters is spirit. Yours shines." Then came the video call. Elena's heart pounded as she clicked accept. The image flickered, and there he was. Ryan, clad in what looked like heavy work gear, standing in front of pipes and machinery that suggested an oil rig. His smile was warm, his voice steady. For Elena, it was proof that he was real. Yet if she had looked closer, the cracks were there. The lighting didn't quite match the setting. The background noise sounded oddly uniform, like a looped recording. But Elena, swept up in the relief of seeing him live, ignored the subtle inconsistencies. She told herself that technology was imperfect, that long-distance calls often distorted reality. What mattered was that he showed up, face to face, for her. The calls became more frequent. Sometimes he would speak about his exhausting shifts, other times about how much he longed for a family of his own. He asked Elena what her ideal future looked like. And she found herself describing evenings in the garden, Sunday mass together, and quiet dinners where she would no longer sit alone. Ryan listened attentively, nodding, adding, "That's the life I want too." The effect was intoxicating. Elena, who had carried burdens alone for years, now felt as though she had a partner, even if he was thousands of miles away. Her days at the shop still began with fabric and thread, but her evenings ended with his voice, his messages, his reassurances that she mattered. Friends noticed the change. Her employees whispered that their boss seemed lighter, humming while she worked. Her sister teased her gently, asking if someone new had entered her life. Elena smiled but deflected, unwilling to reveal too much too soon. She wanted to hold on to this fragile bloom of hope before exposing it to scrutiny. But subtle oddities began to creep in. Ryan's stories shifted slightly depending on the day. Once he said he was raised by an aunt, another time by a family friend. When she asked about his church in Houston, his answers were vague, always steering back to how much he admired her faith instead. These details pricked at her suspicion, but she dismissed them quickly. After all, people sometimes blurred their pasts, especially when revisiting painful memories. And Ryan's attentiveness outweighed the doubts. He remembered her birthday, asked after Arturo's work, even encouraged Paolo's engineering dreams. By the end of February, the tone of their exchanges deepened further. He began calling her affectionate names, telling her he couldn't wait for the day they would pray together in person. Elena's heart, once guarded, was opening wider than she thought possible. What she didn't realize was that every word, every carefully chosen compliment, every shift from respectful to intimate, was part of a deliberate design. Ryan knew how to weave vulnerability into admiration, how to create a rhythm that felt natural but was, in truth, calculated. For Elena, it was the beginning of a love story she had thought impossible. For Ryan, or rather, for Darian Cruz Mendoza, the man behind the mask, it was the beginning of a trap. By early March, the tone of Ryan's messages began to change. What had started as soft compliments and shared prayers now carried a new thread: urgency. The first request came almost casually, folded into an evening chat about his work. He told Elena that a co-worker had been injured on the rig. The company, he claimed, wasn't covering the medical costs. "He's like a brother to me," he wrote, followed by a plea. Could she lend $800 so the man could get treatment? Elena hesitated. It was one thing to trade messages of affection. It was another to involve money. She reread the text several times, weighing her options, but Ryan's words tugged at her heart. She knew what it meant to stand helpless beside a loved one in pain. She wired the money the next day, telling herself it was an act of compassion, not weakness. Ryan's gratitude came swiftly, voice notes overflowing with thanks, promises to repay her soon. For Elena, the transaction felt like more than money. It was proof of trust, of partnership. But the requests didn't stop there. A week later, Ryan said some of his equipment had been stolen. Without it, he claimed, he couldn't keep working. This time, the amount was $200. He painted a picture of desperation. Without his gear, he would lose his income, jeopardizing their future together. Elena's chest tightened. She told herself this was temporary, that she was helping him get back on his feet for their life. Again, she wired the money. Within days, another message arrived. Ryan described what he called a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a small investment in a startup that, according to him, would give them financial security. All he needed was $3,500 to secure his share. This time, Elena sat with the request longer. She thought about her employees, about her children's warnings. She remembered Lena's words, "Mama, this isn't how real love starts." But then Ryan messaged again, weaving in lines about their future. "We'll build something lasting," he told her. "This is for us." That phrase, "for us," was her undoing. She wanted so badly to believe that someone was finally planning a future with her that she convinced herself the money was a small price for a dream. She wired the $3,500. By now, Elena's children had begun to notice irregularities. Arturo spotted bank slips tucked into a drawer during a visit home. Lena saw her mother scrolling messages late at night, her face flushed with a mix of worry and longing. One evening, Lena confronted her. "Mama," she said softly, holding up the statements, "you've sent thousands to someone you've never even met." Elena's face paled, her lips parting to explain. "He needed help," she whispered. "He's building a life with me." The conversation escalated when Arturo stepped in. Protective and furious, he demanded that they report Ryan. "This isn't love, Mama. It's a scam." His voice thundered through the house, but Elena stood her ground, tears streaking her cheeks. "You don't understand," she cried. "He listens to me. He sees me." Paolo, usually quiet, tried a different approach. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "Please don't go, Ma," he whispered. "Don't travel alone to meet him." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in her eyes. But Ryan's influence was already deep. Every time she wavered, he seemed to sense it. His messages grew more intimate, more insistent. He painted vivid images of their future. Sunday mornings at church, evenings in a shared home, laughter in her garden. For Elena, those visions dulled the sting of her children's objections. Even outside her family, concern mounted. Father Raphael, the parish priest who had known her for decades, pulled her aside after Mass. "I've heard of these predators," he cautioned gently. "They promise love, but leave only pain." Elena's eyes filled, but she shook her head. "He's different, Father. I believe in him." Her business partner, Auntie Marites, was more blunt. Over merienda one afternoon, she warned Elena that her cousin had once been tricked the same way. Sweet words from abroad, money requests, and eventually heartbreak. Elena listened, but her heart resisted. The alternative, to admit she had been deceived, was too painful. Finally, even Captain Domingo, a local officer and distant family friend, approached her. He explained the mechanics of romance scams, how scammers used fake profiles and rehearsed scripts. He offered to investigate, to trace where her money had gone. Elena thanked him politely but declined. Sometimes love requires faith, not proof, she said, her voice trembling with conviction. The people around her could see what she could not, that Ryan's words were a net, tightening with every compliment, every promise, every request. By the time March arrived, Elena's heart was caught in a tug-of-war, her family's urgent pleas on one side, Ryan's carefully crafted affection on the other. She told herself she was strong, that she knew the risks, that love required trust. But beneath those reassurances, cracks were forming. She had begun to notice Ryan's evasions, the calls he couldn't answer, the shifting stories about his past, the vague details about his life in Texas. She felt the unease growing, but each time it surfaced, she pushed it down. After all, she told herself, hadn't she already invested too much to turn back? The message from Ryan arrived on a humid evening in early March, just as Elena was finishing her nightly prayers. Her phone buzzed with a notification. "Surprise, Mahal. I bought your plane ticket." Attached was an itinerary, Manila to Dubai, then on to Dallas. The total cost listed was $2,400. Elena's heart leapt. She whispered aloud, "It's real. He really wants me there." What she did not know was that the money used to purchase that ticket wasn't his at all. It came from the very funds she had already wired him. To her, however, it felt like proof. Proof that Ryan was serious, that all the promises of shared Sundays and garden dinners were not just words. Elena's excitement soon outpaced her caution. Within days, she made a decision that shocked even those closest to her. She visited her bank and liquidated her business savings, $1,800 she had painstakingly set aside over years of sacrifice. She sent it all to Ryan, framing it as an investment in our future. He reassured her with messages dripping in gratitude. "You won't regret this. Soon, it will all pay off." Back at home, Elena gathered her children around the dining table. Her face glowed with anticipation as she delivered the news. "I'm taking an extended vacation in America," she told them. "Ryan and I have been planning this for months. It's finally happening." The reaction was immediate. Arturo slammed his hand against the table. "Mama, you cannot go alone. This is dangerous." His protective instincts boiled over, anger masking fear. Lena's eyes welled with tears. "Please, Mama, listen. We're not against your happiness, but something isn't right. You've never even met him." Paolo sat silently at first, his spoon untouched on the plate. Then, in a low, trembling voice, he pleaded, "Don't leave us, Ma. At least, not like this." But Elena, her resolve hardened by months of sweet words and her own desperate yearning, refused to yield. "I deserve this chance," she said firmly, though her hands shook as she spoke. "You'll understand when you see how happy he makes me." The days leading to her departure were heavy with tension. Arturo made calls to contacts he hoped could verify Ryan's identity, but nothing conclusive surfaced. Lena stayed up late drafting long messages to her mother, listing warning signs, begging her to reconsider. Paolo retreated into silence, his worry expressed only in the way he lingered near her, as though trying to hold her back without words. On the morning of her flight, the family gathered for breakfast. The air was thick with unspoken dread. Plates clinked softly, but no one ate much. Elena forced a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Don't worry so much. I'll be fine." Her children exchanged glances, each face shadowed with fear. Arturo finally muttered, "This feels like goodbye." Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "No, hijo, this is the beginning." After the meal, she zipped her suitcase shut. Inside were carefully folded dresses, small gifts she had bought for Ryan, and a well-worn Bible she had carried since her wedding day. As she closed the case, a flicker of doubt passed through her mind, an echo of Lena's voice, of Captain Domingo's warnings, of Father Raphael's gentle counsel. But she pushed it aside. Faith required trust, she reminded herself. And hadn't she trusted through storms before, At the airport, she dressed in her best: navy blouse, pressed slacks, modest jewelry. She wanted Ryan's first impression to be one of dignity. She stood in line with her ticket, her phone buzzing with Ryan's messages. "I can't wait to hold you. This is our destiny." Elena snapped a photo of herself at the gate, smiling brightly despite the storm of nerves beneath. She sent it to her children with the caption, "Your mama's going on an adventure." As the boarding call echoed, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. For her, this wasn't just a journey to another country. It was a leap toward the love she had convinced herself was waiting. But for those who loved her most, it felt like the moment they were losing her, not to distance, but to a dream that had already cost too much. The wheels touched down at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport late in the afternoon. After nearly a full day of travel, Davao to Manila, Manila to Dubai, Dubai to Dallas, Elena Navarro stepped into the arrivals hall clutching her handbag and a small piece of luggage. Her heart raced. This was it, the moment she had replayed in her mind 100 times. And then she saw him. Standing awkwardly near the crowd of families and chauffeurs was a man holding a modest bouquet of flowers. His smile flickered as their eyes met. He waved. Elena froze. He was recognizable, but not exactly the man from the pictures. Older, his face rougher, heavier lines at the corners of his mouth. He seemed broader, too, in a way that felt unfamiliar. She hesitated for a beat, but then he hurried forward, thrusting the flowers toward her. "Mahal," he said softly, the word clumsy on his tongue. "You're even more beautiful in person." Elena's doubt melted, if only briefly. She let him take her hand, let herself believe the difference was just poor camera angles, bad lighting in old photos. After all, here he was, flesh and blood. The man who had prayed with her over text, who called her at night when loneliness pressed too heavy, who told her they would build a future together. Ryan, his real name still hidden, insisted on carrying her bag. They walked to the parking structure, his hand never leaving her suitcase handle. The evening was warm and sticky, Texas humidity clinging to her clothes. Elena glanced around, expecting perhaps a hotel near the airport, a welcoming place where she could call her children and reassure them she was safe. Instead, Ryan merged onto the highway heading south. The first 30 minutes passed with chatter, him asking about her flight, her describing the layover in Dubai, both laughing nervously about the long queues at immigration. But the further they drove, the less familiar the landscape became. The city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by long stretches of industrial parks, then open fields. Elena's heart began to thud uneasily. "Are we far?" she asked carefully. "Not much," Ryan replied. His tone was low, almost soothing. "I wanted us somewhere private. No distractions. Just us." She nodded, forcing a smile, but her fingers curled tight around her phone in her lap. She considered messaging Lena, but stopped. She didn't want to appear mistrustful so soon. This was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful, wasn't it? 2 hours later, the car pulled into a faded roadside motel in Port Arthur. The neon sign buzzed overhead, half the letters flickering out. Ryan parked, left the engine running, and went inside to pay. He returned with a single key, grinning. "Room 108, perfect for us." Elena glanced at the building. The paint peeled from the walls, the parking lot was cracked with weeds, hardly the romantic start she had imagined, but she swallowed her disappointment. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe tomorrow they would move to a nicer place. As they walked toward the room, Elena thumbed her phone and quickly typed a message to Lena. "He's wonderful. We're going somewhere quiet to get to know each other. Don't worry." She hit send before stepping through the doorway. Inside, the room was dim, smelling faintly of disinfectant. A bed with a worn quilt, a small dresser, a humming air conditioner in the corner. Ryan set her bag down and closed the door firmly behind them. The motel clerk, watching from behind the counter, later recalled the scene. "She looked happy but tired," he said. He seemed nervous, kept his head down, paid in cash, didn't even give his name. At the time, it didn't strike him as unusual. Travelers came and went without stories all the time. Security footage showed them entering room 108 at 7:23 p.m. It would be the last clear image of Elena alive. Once the door clicked shut, the warmth in Ryan's demeanor began to cool. The easy charm of his messages, the patient smile from the airport, all of it seemed to slip like a mask. Elena tried to brush away the unease, reminding herself that long journeys could make anyone irritable. But deep inside, something shifted. The love story she believed she had flown halfway across the world for was unraveling faster than she could comprehend. The first night in room 108 passed without Elena contacting her family, beyond that single text to Lena. Her children waited for updates, expecting more photos, more excited messages about her first evening in America. Instead, their phones remained quiet. At first, they told themselves she was just tired. A 20-hour journey could exhaust anyone. Maybe she had fallen asleep early, curled up in her new partner's arms. The thought pained Arturo and Lena, but they hoped it explained her silence. By the next evening, worry had sharpened into fear. Arturo tried calling her several times. Each attempt went unanswered. Lena's messages showed double ticks, marked as delivered, but no replies came. Paolo, usually the calmest, began pacing the family's living room in Quezon City, muttering that something was wrong. 48 hours later, panic was undeniable. Elena, who had once messaged them daily, even during her busiest days at the shop, had vanished from their screens. Lena finally dialed the Philippine consulate in Dallas. Her voice cracked as she explained the situation. Her mother had traveled alone to meet a man she met online, had promised to keep in touch, and now she had gone silent. The staff at the consulate listened carefully. They had heard similar stories before. Protocol dictated that they file a request with local police to conduct a welfare check. Meanwhile, Arturo reached out to a friend in the airline industry, confirming that Elena had indeed boarded her flight and landed in Dallas as scheduled. But beyond that, there was no record of where she had gone. Back in Texas, the chain of inquiries began. Local police contacted the motel in Port Arthur after tracing Elena's name through travel records. At first, the staff didn't recall anything unusual. Guests came and went, but one clerk remembered a woman who seemed excited yet weary, accompanied by a man who looked anxious. He had paid in cash, offered no identification, and requested privacy. When pressed, the clerk mentioned something else, a strange odor seeping from room 108. At first, he had assumed it was food gone bad or cleaning supplies left too long, but the smell lingered, heavy and foul, growing stronger each day. By March 21st, officers arrived at the motel. They knocked on the door of room 108. No response. They knocked again, harder. Still silence. The door appeared to be blocked from the inside. With mounting dread, they forced it open. What they found inside confirmed the family's worst fears. Elena had not survived. The room showed clear signs of prolonged captivity, her belongings strewn about. Her phone lying shattered on the floor, dozens of missed calls from her children flashing across the cracked screen. The life she had built, the dreams she carried, had ended behind that closed door. News traveled quickly back to the Philippines. At 3 a.m, Lena's phone rang. The voice on the other end was steady, too steady, as it delivered the words no child should ever hear. "We found your mother. I'm sorry. She didn't make it." The wail that tore through the Navarro household was raw, a sound born of disbelief and devastation. Arturo punched the wall, tears streaming down his face. Paolo sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to breathe. Lena collapsed onto the floor, clutching her phone, as if holding tighter might change the truth it carried. In Davao City, neighbors who had once admired Elena's strength gathered in stunned silence outside her shuttered shop. Candles flickered on the steps, flowers piled against the door. Parish bells tolled for a woman who had given so much to her community, only to be taken in such a cruel way. The investigation pressed forward quickly. Authorities secured the room, collected evidence, and began piecing together what had happened in the days since Elena had landed in Dallas. They didn't yet know the man's true identity, but his mask was already beginning to crack. For Elena's children, the silence of those 2 days had ended in the most painful way imaginable. And as grief settled over them, one question thundered louder than all others. Who was the man who had lured their mother across an ocean, only to destroy her? Within hours of securing room 108, investigators began sifting through the fragments of Elena Navarro's last days. Her phone, though damaged, held the first trail, dozens of affectionate messages from Ryan Cole Matthews, each filled with promises, prayers, and reassurances. But when forensic analysts traced the number, they found inconsistencies. The SIM card wasn't registered in Houston as Ryan had claimed. It was tied to a low-cost provider servicing Fort Worth. Digging deeper, authorities uncovered bank withdrawals linked to Elena's accounts. Large sums, corresponding with the very transfers she had made in the Philippines, were siphoned off through ATMs in Texas. Surveillance cameras captured a man withdrawing the money, and he looked nothing like the clean-cut oil worker from the photos. He was older, rougher, his features sharper, his demeanor hurried. By March 23rd, police released his real name, Darian Cruz Mendoza, 26 years old, an unemployed construction worker from Fort Worth with a string of petty crimes in his past. Fraud, theft, domestic complaints. Records that painted a portrait of someone skilled at deception but never properly stopped. Even more shocking was the discovery of his accomplice, Tanya Velasquez, his girlfriend. She had known about the scheme from the beginning, investigators said. She helped craft messages, encouraged Darian to target women abroad, and even confronted Elena in the motel when jealousy overcame her. This wasn't just Darian's plan. It was their partnership in cruelty. The timeline grew clearer. For years, Darian had operated under different aliases, spinning stories of faith and hard work to lure women into his orbit. At least 2 older Filipino women had previously wired him money. They survived their encounters, but out of shame or fear, they never filed charges. That silence allowed him to keep preying, refining his lies until Elena became his next victim. Investigators pieced together evidence from multiple fronts. Digital trail, messages, photos, and staged video calls stored on his devices. Financial records, cash withdrawals matching Elena's transfers, some as high as $10,000. Witness testimony, motel staff recalling his nervous behavior, neighbors in Fort Worth confirming Tanya's involvement. DNA and fingerprints collected from room 108, linking both Darian and Tanya directly to the crime scene. The net tightened, but Darian and Tanya weren't sitting still. By the time police issued arrest warrants, the couple had fled Port Arthur. Their last known location placed them traveling east, using Elena's money to fund their escape. 3 tense days followed. Then on March 25th, U.S. Marshals tracked them to a casino in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Surveillance showed them laughing at slot machines, Tanya clutching a designer purse, Darian cashing in chips. They seemed oblivious to the inevitability closing in. When officers moved in, the arrest was swift. Witnesses described Tanya sobbing, insisting she had only followed Darian's lead. Darian, defiant, shouted that Elena had given him the money willingly, twisting the narrative even as cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Back in Texas, the Navarro children received the news. Arturo clenched his fists, whispering, Finally. Lena broke down, torn between relief at justice and anguish at its futility. Nothing could bring their mother back. Paolo, voice barely audible, asked the question that would haunt them. Why her? The trial began in June 2025. The courthouse filled with reporters and community advocates. Prosecutors laid out their case with brutal clarity. Darian and Tanya had targeted Elena deliberately, using religion and romance as weapons. They presented chat logs, financial statements, and expert testimony on online grooming tactics. The defense attempted to paint a different picture, claiming Elena's death was an accident during a robbery gone wrong, that she had willingly funded Darian out of love. But the evidence shredded those arguments. The timeline showed premeditation, the control exerted over Elena, and the cruelty of her final days. In the end, the jury returned unanimous verdicts. Darian Cruz Mendoza was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tanya Velasquez received 25 years for accessory to murder and fraud. As the judge delivered the sentences, he spoke words that echoed beyond the courtroom. This was not a robbery. This was calculated manipulation, ending in tragedy. A woman lost her life because trust was weaponized. For the Navarro family, the verdict offered only partial solace. Justice was served, but the void left by Elena's absence could never be filled. She had crossed an ocean for love, only to find betrayal waiting. Still, her story would not fade quietly. Community leaders, international press, and lawmakers began to ask questions. How many others were at risk? How many Ryans were still out there, waiting for the next Elena to believe in them? The mask had finally been removed, but the damage it had concealed could never be undone. Elena Navarro's body was flown back to Davao City under the escort of consular officials. When the casket arrived at the parish where she had spent years volunteering, hundreds gathered: neighbors, employees from her shop, church members, and her family. Candles flickered outside the church gates, their light casting long shadows as mourners whispered prayers. For Arturo, Lena, and Paolo, the moment was surreal. Their mother, who had fought so hard to keep them fed, educated, and safe, was now returning home in silence. At her funeral mass, Father Raphael reminded the congregation that Elena had been more than the way she died. She was a woman of faith, a mother of resilience, a businesswoman whose generosity had carried many through hardship. Her life was sacrifice and love, he said, his voice steady, and that is what must be remembered. Among Elena's belongings recovered in Texas was a letter she had written in her final days before leaving. The note, simple and trembling in handwriting, read, "If something happens, know that I still believe in love." Those words, brief yet powerful, struck her children deeply. It was not gullibility that defined her, but her enduring hope that even after loss, companionship was possible. The trial's conclusion gave the family little comfort. Darian Cruz Mendoza was condemned to spend his life in prison. Tanya Velasquez would serve decades behind bars. Yet no sentence could replace a mother's embrace or a grandmother's future presence. For Elena's children, justice was not victory but necessity, a recognition that their mother's trust had been abused in the most devastating way. Outrage at the case grew internationally. Commentators on Philippine radio and American newspapers alike asked, how many women like Elena were out there right now, speaking to faceless profiles, pouring their hopes into conversations with predators? Advocacy groups used her story to push for reforms. Cross Paths, the dating app that had connected her with Darian, faced scrutiny in courts. The Navarro family filed a civil case, arguing the platform had failed to protect its users through identity checks and background safeguards. In response, lawmakers in both countries began debating stricter regulations for online dating platforms. mandatory identity verification, background screening for users, automated flagging of suspicious money requests. Elena's tragedy, though irreversible, sparked conversations that could prevent others from walking into the same trap. Back home, her textile shop eventually reopened under Arturo's care. The hum of sewing machines returned, but her absence lingered in every corner. Employees often spoke of her kindness, remembering how she once stayed up all night to finish a customer's wedding dress, or how she slipped money quietly into an envelope for a worker's sick child. Her generosity lived on in the community, even as grief remained etched into her children's faces. Lena, reflecting on her mother's story, said to a local journalist, "We're not angry at Mama. We're angry at those who used her love as a weapon." Her words resonated widely, reminding others that victims of romance scams are not naive fools, but people who, like anyone, seek connection. For viewers, Elena's journey carries a warning and a plea. Romance scams are not about foolishness, they are about design. They exploit loneliness, trust, and hope. They use love as bait. And anyone, regardless of age, status, or faith, can be vulnerable. So the question becomes, how do we protect those we love without extinguishing their hope? The answer lies in vigilance, in conversations that may feel uncomfortable, in teaching one another to pause when someone online asks for secrecy or money. It lies in encouraging second opinions, in checking details, in believing survivors rather than shaming them. Elena Navarro's life was not defined by Room 108. It was defined by decades of hard work, by the children she raised, by the prayers she whispered at dawn, and by her refusal to give up on love, even after tragedy. She deserved safety. She deserved truth. She deserved a love that was real. Her story asks us not only to mourn, but to act, to watch over our mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends, to remind them gently that real love never demands secrecy, never drains bank accounts, never hides behind excuses. In the end, Elena's candle of hope burned bright, even as darkness tried to snuff it out. It is now up to those left behind to carry that flame, to ensure no other family receives a call in the middle of the night saying, "We found your mother. I'm sorry, she didn't make it."